and it's with great pleasure that I introduce Marianne Bamberlo. A great many of us already know Marianne because she's spoken to us many times and has always given us a wonderful, thought-provoking presentation. So if you've got any problem shady areas in your garden, tonight is the night all your problems are going to be solved. Marianne is going to talk to us about planting in your shady areas. I also, I'm very interested in Marianne's beautiful garden on the St. Lawrence. That might be an idea for our group to do a tour at one time, a planned tour or something like that. It sounds fabulous. Anyway, without any further ado, I would like to introduce Marianne Bamberlo. Thank you.
Thank you, Alice, and thank you, Penny. Let's get right into it, assuming the technology is going to cooperate. And of course, it's not going to. There. Okay, when we talk about shade, first thing we have to define is what, types of shade there are. And of course, we know that's driven by how many hours of sun an area gets. So we have full shade, which would only be 2 to 4 hours of sun. Part shade, 4 to 6 hours of sun. Well, dappled shade, it's under an open canopy, so it could be, 2 hours, could be 6 hours. It really depends how dense that canopy is. And you'd almost need a light meter to gauge that. There's dry shade. So let's say you're trying to plant under a large conifer. Well, we know that a conifer is basically like a big umbrella, so that's a very dry area. And there's also moist shade, such as a shady area, but along a stream or in a low spot on your property. And it's not just the shade that is the problem. Often shade is a result of trying to grow plants under a tree, and you're dealing with a massive root structure. So, there's other types of shade. Obviously, a building can cast shade or structures can cast shade, but quite often it's trees that we're dealing with. So that brings a whole set of problems unto itself. And we used to think of shade or the roots of a tree being like we see on the left, but actually it's more like what we see on the right, where the roots extend well beyond the tree drip line itself, and they don't go way down. They're actually very shallow. So that's why it's so difficult to plant around trees such as maple with a very dense root system. So site preparation is going to be very important if you're dealing with tree roots and shade. And there's a number of ways around that. Pocket planting, add lots of organic matter, try and mimic the rich earth on a forest floor. We've got lots of roots in the forest, but yet things grow and it's like cushy and lots of humus there. So, if we can mimic that in our own gardens, that would be great. Don't smother the tree roots. Trees need oxygen and moisture, and they get that through their root system, their feeder roots that are very close to the surface. So if we put too much on top of it in the way of soil, we can smother those tree roots. And never bury the tree trunk. Roots have the genetic makeup to be moist all the time, but tree trunks do not. So you want to make sure that the soil just goes below the root flare, and that's where the trunk of the tree flares out to the roots. So that root flare should be visible when you're planting a tree, and should always be visible. You should not be burying it with mulch or extra soil. You would be jeopardizing the health of your tree if you did that. So you never add more than 2 inches or 5 centimeters of soil or organic matter over those tree roots. And pocket planting, what I mentioned earlier, is just where you just make a small enough hole to get, or big enough hole to get a small plant in. And then of course you're going to have to pamper it a bit because it's not going to get a lot of moisture falling from the sky. So it's going to take a little TLC to get it established. But if you pick the right plant, once it's established, it should grow well in the little pocket that you've eked out for it. Now, this was the best picture I could find of pocket planting, but I just want to point out that the root flare is not visible on this tree, so that's a no-no. And this is Japanese spurge, which is also a no-no because it can be quite invasive. So, and it's not a native species, obviously. But the picture was intended to get across the point of pocket planting. And this is a common mistake. We all think that, oh, I'll build a tree well around that tree and that'll save it. But you can see from the depth of this tree well that it's well over the 2 centimeters. So all the roots that go way out beyond this tree are their oxygen supply has been cut off, not to mention their moisture and nutrients because it's got to wash down through all that soil. And you can see there's already a problem here that when it rains hard enough, this obviously fills with water and there's sand all around this tree from when that happens. And then you can see from the tree well picture on the right that this poor tree's already succumbed to a sure death caused by raising the level of the soil on its roots. And you can work around a tree if you do have to change the level of the soil around it. And on the left will be the wrong way to do it. And the right would be a better way to do it. Now, to me, this should be extended even further because that might work for the tree now. But remember the earlier picture, we showed how far the tree roots actually go out. So it's not just to the drip line, it's well beyond. So if you could do something like that, that would probably reduce the stress on your tree. I mean, yes, the roots here are still at the right level and will supply quite a bit of oxygen and air, but not if there's paving stones here too. So this poor tree is getting a double whammy. And of course, there's the grunt work if you're going to get your site preparation done. And there are some shortcuts we can do to that prep work. For instance, if you're adding a new bed in, any bed, but we're working in shade here. So one quick tip is to lay out a garden hose and always try and do, well, I guess it depends on your design style. If you're doing formal, you might want straight lines, but usually sweeping, flowing curves are more appealing to the eye. So a garden hose is a good way to get an idea of what it might look like. Now, before you commit spade to the earth here, I would get the lawnmower out and just, without turning it on, you don't want to chop up your garden hose, but just walk the lawnmower along this line and see if it flows well. I mean, if it's going to make your maintenance more difficult, then that's not the right design. In fact, I can see this corner here is a problem already because you cannot push a lawnmower into that corner and get that corner flown and then go that direction. You'd be better off to do this at a nice flowing curve like that you could actually move a lawnmower along. And then, of course, if you've got your plant material ready, lay it out, move it around, see what looks good. Any of you in plant design or floral design will know that odd numbers look better. And in my opinion, this is a perfect example of it just not working. They've got two, looks like junipers, upright junipers, and then they've got these two, looks like Chamaecyparis, and it just, your eyes just bouncing boing, 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 back and forth to one to the other. And if you had things in odd numbers, it just flows a bit better. So, that's one thing I would say is not right with this picture, but it's the idea of using the garden hose to shape up your bed and playing with things before you actually put them in the ground so that you don't have to move things after they've been planted. And of course, if you're making a new bed, often you have to remove sod. So there's the old-fashioned sod lifter, the manual one, where you basically spade out a piece and then chop off the sods. Or you can rent a tool that will make that much easier. Or you can do the lasagna or layering method. And this was at my previous property, and I decided I needed room for more daylilies. And I was on a very shady spot. It was a forest, and the city side of the fence was the only sunny spot. So I decided I was going to do a strip garden along the fence. So I basically edged it out because I wanted a clean edge. This is not 100% necessary in the lasagna method. I just find it makes a cleaner edge. So I took that front spade of dirt and piled it in the back. And then you cover all of that with newspaper or cardboard. And you make sure that you overlap those seams really well, because we all know how tough a dandelion is. And if you leave it open seam, it will just push up between it, and then all your work will be for naught. And then you start putting your soil on top. And you finish the whole area, and now you've got a good planting area. Now, in this method, you would not cut through the paper at this stage. You would plant in the new soil you put on top. If you haven't put enough soil on top and you need to go deeper, then you really shouldn't plant yet. You should let that sit for a couple months to make sure that the grass has been smothered out and any weeds underneath the newspaper and, grass, weeds under the newspaper have all been smothered out. Because if I were to cut through that paper right now, I would just be inviting all of that stuff underneath to grow up through it. And let me start over. Adding organic matter is always going to improve your gardens, and shade is no exception to that. I think one of the big problems is for years we thought we had to have immaculate yards, and people rake up every leaf and bag lawn clippings, and we're basically robbing our soil of organic matter. Remember the picture way at the beginning of the tree with all the roots exposed? Well, that's not normal. You don't see that in forests. That's because all the leaves fall, the branches fall, and no one rakes them away or gets the leaf blower out. That is the soil receding because all the organic matter has decomposed from within it, and it hasn't been replenished. So anytime you can add organic matter, and this was City of Ottawa leaf and yard waste compost, black gold in my opinion, but just top dress, and as I said, not more than the 5 centimeters, but enough that it will feed and work its way through. You don't have to work it in. The worms will pull it in, the rain will percolate the nutrients through. So just a good chop dressing of that. And again, on the same vein of organic matter, this was my garden. As I said, it was in a forest. And so there were always lots of leaves, mostly maple leaves dropping. And this is a flower bed in April. Yes, April. And there's a flagstone patio and walkway around it. And I did not remove any leaves. In fact, I probably raked some or off of the pathway and off the patio into the bed. And then this is the same bed in June. No leaves were removed. No one ran through, and occasionally you might have to take a handful of leaves off the spears of a hostas that's poking through. Sometimes they get stuck on those, but this is the exact same area. No leaves have been removed, and you can't see that they're there. In fact, they're probably by the end of summer, you won't even see them anymore because they will have broken down and the worms will have pulled them into the soil. Sorry, someone just rang the doorbell, which I'm not going to go and answer, but Thor's going to go take care of them. So yes, there's no reason to rake your leaves. In fact, you're robbing your soil of good nutrients. Think of it, the leaves, those trees are taking up nutrients from your soil, and when they drop, that's your opportunity to get all those nutrients back. So if you just bag them up and send them away and then go buy fertilizer, you're kind of defeating the purpose here. So I hope you can't hear that because there's a lot of barking going on in the background. This is an area of my previous yard that was a problem area. And not only because it was shady, because it was also a hill with clay soil, and I could not get grass to grow. I tried aerating it. I tried top dressing it. I reseeded many times, and it always ended up looking like this. So I thought, why fight it anymore? I had garden beds here and a garden bed here. So I just said, I'm just going to, because it's a slope, I need to do a level pathway and then just put more garden beds in. So this was November 2009, end of the month, and it was quite warm that season. So I thought, I'm going to get a head start on this. And I started just digging where the pathway would go. And I figured that would be my motivation to get this done in the spring. And that's what I ended up with. So I just made more beds. I terraced it a bit by putting in a little bit of retainer wall, extended the flagstone pathway that was here, that already was here, that you kind of saw in the previous picture. I had to deal with downspouts, so basically a dry riverbed and overflow from the rain barrel would come down Riverstone. And one thing you can do if you're adding a new garden, whether it's shade or sun, and you want to get that cohesiveness or flow, is to use some of your existing plant matter. And that'll give repetition and make it feel like it's part of the existing gardens, because you're visually seeing some of the same things here and there and everywhere, so it flows together. So divided some hostas and filled in some spaces. So you can see that in the matter of about 10 months, with a big chunk of that being winter, we went from my problem area to a beautiful new garden. So now, when you're looking at plants that you're going to buy for your shade garden, there's a number of things to think about. So for plant health, think about whether or not it's a drought-tolerant plant, because chances are, if it's under a tree, it's not going to get a great amount of moisture. It's got to be shade-tolerant. Usually shallow-rooted works best, or a deep taproot. In between doesn't seem to work that well, but shallow-rooted tends to get the if there's morning dews or even a light rain, or a taproot that goes way down. And for design purposes, you want to think about foliage interest, whether it's got some texture or color or variegation, because quite often there's not a lot of blooms on shade plants. Light colored flowers will pop in a shady area. Scent is very big too for the shade, because if you don't have the visual impact of a flower, sometimes the scent will draw you in. And think of your garden should always have layers of interest. So think of the forest, and you've got your tall trees, and then your shorter trees, and then your ground plants. Well, that's, the layer of interest you need to add in your shade garden is often that understory, the lower level shrubs and trees. So that will get your eye going up and down as well as from side to side. And just remember, there's a big difference between shade-tolerant or shade-loving plant. Some plant suggestions. We're just going to go through some plants now that, make good additions to your shade garden. So there's native and woodland plants, shrubs, perennials, annuals and containers, and of course, bulbs for shade. And now starting with some natives, Baneberry or Ectea has a small white flower, about 12 inches tall, and then it's followed by these beautiful red berries. Now, these are not edible, and the name Baneberry kind of tells you that. They're extremely bitter, and I don't even think you could swallow one, apparently, from what I've read about it. So I don't think that would be an issue if you've got pets or children. And it likes part shade and moist soil. And throughout this, when I talk about moist soil, I'm not talking about constantly wet. I'm just talking about that rich, moist feeling when you walk through a forest or you grab a handful of soil from the forest. It's not sopping, but it's got some moisture to it. So that's what you really need to mimic in your shade garden. Jack in the pulpits, we've got the native form in these two larger pictures, and then their Japanese cousin, Cicopianum here. So all in the arum family, and these are Erisema trifilo and Erisema tricopianum. And they like full to part shade and moist acidic soil. Now, when I say acidic soil, it doesn't have to be like blueberry acidic. It's just not alkaline. So most plants will tolerate something about 6.5, 7 is neutral, 6.5, so just slightly acidic. Our Canadian ginger forms a nice ground cover. It's a good alternative to some of the invasive ground covers. It's not got a showy flower. In fact, it's the flower over here. And you'd have to get down on your hands and knees and look under the leaves to find that flower. It is actually pollinated by slugs, and that's why it's so low and open like that, because the slugs can crawl in and pollinate. And again, it's a low grower, probably, if it's really happy, it might get 8 inches tall. It's not good for foot traffic, so not on a pathway, but definitely a good grower. And it likes full to part shade and moist soil. And this is the marsh marigold. The single is our native marsh marigold, but there's also a double form that's quite showy. And it's good for the side of a stream or the side of a pond. I've got it growing on the seawall, or the soil in front of the seawall along the St. Lawrence. So it's it doesn't need to have a wet beach, but it does need some moisture. So it likes part shade and moist soil. So the double's called Flora Plano. Bushberry or Cornus canadensis. And this one really does need acidic soil. It's not happy at all in neutral to alkaline soil. So if you can get it, if you've got the right conditions, it can be beautiful. It's low growing, 6 to 8 inches, has these beautiful flowers, and followed by berries, and foliage changes color in the fall. Forms a good dense mat when it's happy, and makes a great ground cover. We have some beautiful terrestrial native orchids. The yellow one, Parviflorum, is one of the native ones, and Cypripedium reginae, Lake Queen's lady slipper, giant lady slipper, and this is a cultivar, hybridized cultivar. But again, if you got the conditions for it, they make a wonderful addition to the garden. And once they're happy, they can colonize quite nicely and form a big clump. And we have our relatives to bleeding heart. These are native, and there's Dicentra cucularia, which is the Dutchman's breeches over here. And we have Dicentra canadense, which is here, and you can see the slightly different shape. Dutchman's breeches said to resemble the old-fashioned Dutch person's pants, and the standard bleeding heart style flower. These are spring ephemerals. They often go dormant after they've done their thing, and just a dainty harbinger of spring. They like full to part shade and moist soil. Our trout lily, excuse me, just need to take a drink again. This goes by many names: fawn lily, trout lily, dogtooth violet. Gets its name from the mottled leaves that are said to resemble the speckles on a trout. Colonizes, you'll see lots of leaves and a few flowers. It won't bloom unless it's in a colony. And it likes full to part shade and moist conditions. And it's probably only about 4 to 6 inches tall. So very dainty. Again, an ephemeral will go dormant after it's bloomed and put on its growth for the next year. Julennia Tripoliata. This is a nice native plant. It almost looks like a small flower clematis when you get a big bush of it. There's also a pink form of it, and it only gets about 3.5 feet tall. Blooms in about June, and then looks attractive the rest of the season just as a foliage plant. Part shade, moist soil. Hepatica acuta or liver leaf, and it's got the 3 lobes like a liver. It's got that patterning, has very sweet blooms, often come up before the foliage, and then the foliage comes up. Very dainty, tiny little flower. Does not go dormant. The foliage remains for the year, and or for the season, I should say. And it's only about maybe 6 inches tall. This is a great ground cover. Now, it probably shouldn't take a lot of foot traffic, but it's quite a prolific spreader. So even if you were to step on some of them, I don't think you would ever kill it. It's the Canadian mayapple, and some people call it the wild lily of the valley. Its growth habit is very similar. They're not in the same family, but it spreads by that same wiry rhizome underneath the soil. It's not as hard to remove, but it's a good alternative for a native ground cover, and it will take part shade and moist soil. Virginia bluebells, just a beautiful shade of blue. When it's still in bud, the flowers are quite a darker purple, and then when it starts to open, it's that beautiful sky blue. Martensio Virginica likes part shade, moist soil, and it will go dormant after it's finished blooming. It will self-seed quite a bit, and then where I have it growing, I actually encourage it to do so. But again, if you're trying to keep something more reined in, then just deadhead it before it has a chance to do that. Metella Brewerie, closely related to Heuchera tiarella, very similar in that it forms a rosette of leaves, but then it sends up these neat flower spikes, and does well in part shade, moist, acidic soil. Our bloodroot, Canadian bloodroot, comes up very early in the spring. It's one of the first flowers you'll see. And I love the way the flower comes out huddled in the leaf. And then the leaves, once the flowers are done, the leaves get quite huge in the right conditions. And if you have enough moisture, they will stay out all summer. If we get a drought, they will definitely go dormant. They almost look prehistoric in their size and shape. And there's the double form of it, which is quite desired by gardeners. It is definitely it's slow growing. It does not spread as quickly as a single form, of course, but it is definitely a pretty flower to have in your garden. So it likes part shade and moisture, and it only gets about, I'd say 8 to 10 inches tall. Our Ontario floral emblem, the Trillium, a good native plant. The white, of course, and we have the red, the white grandiflorum and Trillium erectum. There is a yellow Trillium luteum, and likes full to part shade and moisture. Depending on your conditions, it may go dormant. If you've got enough moisture and it's happy, it will stay green all summer and continue to feed that rhizome and hopefully give you more growth the next year. Marybelles or Uvularia Grandpora. This is a very small, I don't even call it a clump, small plant, but they can get into grow into quite large size clumps and are quite showy with a big clump. What's really neat about them is how the petals all twist, each individual petal twists, and they like pulls apart shade. There's different forms. This is the grandiflora. There's sessiflora, I think. But they grow to different heights. The 2 different varieties. One's about 12 inches. The other is about 14 to 15 inches, I would say. And some nice ferns, native ferns that will do well in shady conditions. The cinnamon fern is very showy when it first starts unfurling. And then, of course, it has the cinnamon colored spore frond in the middle. And it likes parched shade and moist acidic soil. And it grows to about 24 to 30 inches. Forms a nice clump. It's not one of the running ferns, so a well-behaved fern. And some more native ferns. The maidenhair fern is a well-behaved fern. This is the bracket fern, Pteridinium aquilinum, and that is not a well-behaved fern. So unless you've got a big property and just want, that transition between woodland and a property to be covered, this is not one for the little home garden because it is aggressive. And the male fern, Dryopteris felixmas, that's a well-behaved little fern. But they all like full to part shade and some moisture in their soil. Now we're on to some shrubs for the shade garden, and we're looking at the serviceberry, Amelanchier canadensis, and there are different varieties of Amelanchier. Depending on what you want, there are tree forms and shrub forms, so just do your research. They're all, edible berries. They all have these nice flowers. They have good fall color, but just the shape will be different, and the size and the timing of when they bloom will be different. So do your research on what you want. The berries are edible, but you'd be hard-pressed to beat the birds to them. Likes part shade and moist acidic soil. And rhododendrons and azaleas do well in the shade. They do have a very shallow root system, so probably not good to put them with something like a cedar that also has a very shallow, needy root system. So I got them under oaks here, and they seem to do quite well. And this is the light series of azaleas. I think this is Mandarin lights and golden lights. And there's northern lights, and there's mandarin lights, bright lights. There's a whole series of them, different colors. They are slow to get established, but once they get going, they put on a nice show. These are deciduous azaleas. There are some evergreen azaleas also, but these are quite hardy, and they seem to do well in our climate. So they like part shade and moist acidic conditions. And Japanese maple are a great understory tree shrub for your shade garden, and they can add a punch of color. Orium or full moon Japanese maple. Koto no Ito is the harp string Japanese maple. Bloodgood is probably the hardiest. So if you haven't tried Japanese maple and you're just not sure if it's going to make it in your yard, this would be your starter plant. It's reasonably priced and probably one of the hardier Japanese maples. And this is actually a Korean maple. So very similar in looks. It's got a green leaf all summer, but its fall color is spectacular. So they like part shade and moist soil. And they kind of need that part shade, especially in the winter, so that they don't get too much desiccation. And they're properly pruned Japanese maple can be a piece of art in your garden. So I believe this was at Butchart Gardens, and it's just an amazing specimen when you see something like that. Barbary. Now, Barbary gets a bad rap. The common Barbary is invasive. Cultivars are not so bad. The seeds don't seem to be very fertile on these. And they're also often said that they're a breeding ground for ticks. Now, I would wonder about that. I mean, I haven't done the research, so I can't say categorically, but if I have one Barbary on a property, I don't think all of a sudden I'm going to have a tick infestation. If I have the common Barbary that's escaped and formed a grove in wilderness, I can see then I might get an increase in ticks because they like that dense foliage and the conditions that the Barbary likes. So As I said, I think it's partly a bad rap, but you can decide for yourself if it's something you want to grow. This is Rose Glow. It has a beautiful red tinge on the foliage, small flower followed by berry. Not an edible berry, but it's just another part of its interest. So it likes part shade and moisture, and there's different heights and different forms of them. There's miniatures and there's full-size ones. Pleasure Folia, Ruby Spice. This is a late season bloomer, and it likes part shade, moist soil, acidic conditions. It's heavily scented. You will smell this one before you see it when it's blooming, and it generally blooms in late August to September. Pretty dainty little bottle brush of little blooms. And the foliage looks good the rest of the year, so lots going for it. The dogwoods, there's a lot of interesting dogwoods for the shade, and if you get some of the variegated foliage, it does brighten up in a shady area. And of course, it's got so much more going for it. Berries are interesting, and the birds like them. And then if you've got something like the red twigged or the gold twigged dogwood, you've got some winter interest there also. Also wonderful for floral arranging. And this is just another cornice. This is the silky dogwood, but the color of the berries on this one is just exquisite. Fothergilla is one of my favorite shrubs. I've got a couple different varieties. This is Mount Airy, the cultivar. Little bottle brush flowers. It's not a tall shrub. It's about a meter tall, so 36 to 40 inches tall. Has good deep green foliage all season. Buds are just about to break on these flowers, so I would say I will have flowers in this in maybe 7 to 10 days. And then in the fall, it gets great color also. You will get more blooms on this one the more sun it has. I had it in a previous property in about 4 hours of sun, and I just moved it over about 5 feet so that it got about 6 hours of sun. And you know, it was amazing how much more blooms I got just from that little extra bit of sun. Hydrangeas are a standard for shady gardens, and there's different types. There's the paniculata, which are the cone shape, and this one's limelight up here. We have Macrophylla Endless Summer. And this is one that the big leaf hydrangea that is touted to bloom on old wood, last year's growth, and new wood, this year's growth. But I think most gardeners would question that because we don't seem to get the blooms we want on these. Hopefully, some of you have had a better experience, but I know a lot of people have been disappointed with these because they're not hardy in our area, so they do die down to the ground. Now, we get a lot of new growth on it, and if it lived up to its reputation of blooming on new wood, then we should have a full flush of blooms, but often we don't. And then here's another paniculata, vanilla strawberry, and it's pretty much totally carefree, so it's actually a better choice than Endless Summer from that point of view. Now, Macrophylla, Hydrangea Macrophylla, so this Endless Summer variety, they're the ones that will change color with the acidity of the soil. So it'll be pink if you have alkaline soil and blue if you have acidic soil. But it's the only hydrangea that does that color change. So they like part shade and moisture. And of course, there's a variety of heights for these because of the different cultivars. Magnolias will take some shade. This is the star magnolia, and they're actually blooming now. Unfortunately, things are going over very quickly with this heat, though. Creamy white flowers, lots of them, and then good foliage all summer. And in fall, it turns this bright bronzy gold color, and that's the seed heads on it. So quite showy in multiple seasons. And they can get actually up to 25 feet tall if you've got a single or, a couple stems. If you've got the real shrubby form, it may not get that tall, but if you select out just a couple of the stronger stems, if you want it to get that tall, it will probably do that, grow more upright. Elderberry, Sambucus racemosa, and this might be a good fit if you don't want to do Japanese maple. It's got the same cut-leaf foliage, and it comes in these dark burgundy, black forms and golden forms, and has a nice flower on it. Some of them get the elderberries, which are edible, and it likes part shade and moisture, and of course a variety of heights depending on what variety you're growing. Viburnum, there are many natives. There are also some imports, but they're all good choices. They're very disease resistant. They have a couple pests, but they're mainly manageable. Foliage is nice. Flowers are nice. Berries are edible for the birds. And going back, they're a good one for actually adding layers of interest in the backyard, because some of those do get up to 10 or 12 feet tall. So, having tall trees, and then this size, maybe a shrub, and then your plantings underneath will give you those different layers of interest that you're looking for. And now some perennials, columbine, so many different forms of columbine. And of course, they're very promiscuous cross-pollinators. So if you buy a special variety, don't expect it to stay special forever, because it will cross-pollinate with something else and new seedlings will come up. And if the parent isn't strong enough to survive and come back, then the babies take over and you don't know what you'll get. There is a nice variegated form, again, that's Vulgaris, Aquilegia vulgaris, Marianne group. It just, that color just pops in the shade. So always good to have something that has interest after the bloom is gone. A stilbe, it definitely needs moist shade. Does not do well in dry soil, but can be quite showy, especially in mass plantings of it. There's all different heights and ranges, generally pinks, whites, and mauves, some reds. And this little guy is Perkio. He's a little dwarf. We've got Sprite, also a dwarf. Chinensis pomilla is a nice dwarf. And then, of course, there's the large varieties that can get up to 3.5 feet tall. They like full part shade, and as I said, must have moist soil. Virginia cordifolia, this is a semi-evergreen plant. It looks a little ratty when it first comes up, or when the snow leaves in the spring. They're blooming now, at least they are in my garden. They put on that nice stalk of pink flowers that come out kind of like a candlestick on it. And there is a variegated form that you don't see very often in the retail trade or nurseries. If you can get hold of it, it is quite pretty, and has that thick, glossy foliage, that same as the plain green one, but just the variegation just pops in a shady area. And something I learned a couple of years ago, and I'd never heard this before, is its common name is pig squeak. It's because if you rub the leaves together, it sounds like a pig squeaking. So it likes full to part shade, and it's quite drought tolerant once it's established. So it also makes a good ground cover if you've got a difficult spot and you just want something green. Brunera, and this is Siberian bugloss. And the plain green one's pretty because it's got these dainty forget-me-not-like flowers, and the foliage is quite nice. But there's all kinds of variegated forms that have been hybridized, and they just pop in the garden. This is Hepston cream, but there's also Looking Glass and Jack Frost. They're all quite stunning. So they like full to part shade and moisture. And grasses need sun, but there are sedges, which are grass-like, but they're not true grasses. So this is an example of some of the sedges that you can grow, and they do well in the shade. So Carex is sedge, and we've got Beetlemania here, and this is Evergold, and this is Bull's Golden. And they like part shade in average conditions, average soil. Cimicifuga has been reclassified, so it should actually be calling it Actea. It is, it's very, very scented, and the bees love it. You can see the bees on it. You'll again be able to smell this one or hear the bees buzzing before you actually see the plant. It truly comes alive. It can get quite tall, 4 or 5 feet tall easily, with these long arching flowers that, as I said, are just really nicely scented. Their foliage comes in plain green to almost burgundy brown, and that would be this is black negligee here, but there's one called brunette, I think, that's quite brown. So it likes part shade and moist soil. Now we're on to Cordalis. So it is a fast spreading. It's in the same family as your bleeding heart, so the fumitory family. Okra Luca is quite an aggressive cedar, but it's really easy to pull out. And it just is one of those plants that once it gets going, keeps going all summer long. This is a Pear David. Now it's a little pickier about growing in just your average garden. But if you can get it going, it is quite stunning. I have a small patch of it in my garden, and it is spreading, so it's quite nice. The blue is quite a true blue. And this one may go dormant depending on the season also. And not very tall, only 6 to 8 inches. So in the bleeding heart family also is the true bleeding heart, although they don't call it dicentra anymore, they call it Lamprocactus. The white form, the standard pink form in the background. There's the Valentine one. It's got the red flowers, and gold heart doesn't have gold flowers, but it does have gold foliage. So again, this is one that, depending on the season, it may go dormant after it's finished flowering, or if we have a very wet year, it can stay lush and green all season. Given the past few seasons, I'd say plan on it going dormant and maybe have something in front of it that will hide that bare spot. Epimedium, bishop's hat. It's a pretty little flower. The foliage is very dainty. It has wiry little stems. The flowers resemble basically bishop's hat. That's where it gets its name. And it comes in many colors. This is versicolor, which is that reddish color with the white lines underneath. Then there's also pink and gold ones, white ones, and they like full part shade, dry moist conditions. They're not fussy. They're a good woodland plant that will grow for you. Geraniums, there's some that some that are very aggressive that you shouldn't plant. Jester's Jacket is pretty in that it's got that variegation. It is an aggressive self-seeder, so unless you've got an area that you just want covered with this, it's probably one to avoid. This one is called Margaret Wilson. Pretty variegation on it and not an aggressive spreader, not an aggressive seeder. I've never seen a seedling from it, although it does flower. But the foliage is just so pretty on it. Definitely worth growing. And there's so many other geraniums. Roseanne comes to mind, and Biacovo. But I just wanted to get some with variegated foliage just to show you how they can have more than just be a ground cover with a bloom. They can also have that foliage interest. Blossidium Palmettum almost resembles a peony, a woodland peony. Big, large maple leaves and flower in this mauve color. There's also a white flower form, and it likes full part shade. It gets to about 16 to 18 inches tall, and doesn't seem to be too fussy. It does well. Got it kind of on a higher part of the hillside, so it's not very moist at all. But I've got my garden well mulched, so that seems to help. But It's one that's definitely worth growing if you can find it. Hellebores put on a great show this year, and this one you just have to be patient. Once you buy that plant, it may sit there for even 3 years, and you might think it's just not happy, it's not in the right condition. Just give it time, it will take off. I had a friend who was visiting my garden and saw mine and said, "Oh my God, you can grow hellebores. I'm going to give you mine because mine's not doing anything." I said, "No, no, just be patient and keep it." And the next year in the spring, she sent me a picture of it, basically saying, "Thank God I didn't give it to you," because it was finally taking off for her. So be patient on this one. And the old-fashioned hellebores all had these nodding heads so that you literally had to get down on the ground to see the flower, or turn it upright so that you could see the pretty face. Now they've been hybridizing them so that they actually look upward, which is great because they're blooming so early in the year. You don't want to be crawling around on the ground to look at them. They come in many different pattern colors and doubles and singles. And they like full to part shade and moist conditions. Heuchera is my go-to plant for shade and part shade. They have such brilliant colors and they look great in mass plantings. They can brighten up a corner and they're pretty darn tough. I find they do take some extra care to plant them properly at the beginning. I root wash and take off all the nursery soil of all my plants and then plant them into the resident soil without any amendments. And I find that gives them the best head start, and going into winter, then they have a good root system to get them through, because they are semi-evergreen, but they look pretty ratty when springtime comes. So Heuchera, as I said, one of my go-to plants. We've got the Americana Dale strain, Dolce Peach Melba, Greenfinch, and this is Equal Improved. Then we got Lime Ricky, Mardi Gras, and Snow Angel. And it's the old-fashioned Palace Purple, one of the original colors Heuchera. And it just looks great with some hostas and with this Japanese maple. It adds that touch of color. It echoes the color of the Japanese maple. Gives you that foliage contrast and texture. So great choice, Heucheras. And cousin of the Heuchera is the Tiarella. And this is a native plant, and it does well in full part shade, and it's very drought tolerant. And I threw in Heucherella here, and the reason Tiarella was out of alphabetical order, if you've been watching, it's because I wanted to show you that Heucherella is a cross between Heucheras and Tiarella, and they came up with Heucherella. So very similar characteristics, very drought tolerant, similar foliage, similar flower, just new genetics that give you some new color patterning on it. Hostas, of course, a go-to plant. You either love them or hate them. All kinds of different textures, colors, shapes, sizes. And this is the tiniest I had. I think it was cat size. And then, of course, there's Empress Woo that can get up to 4 feet tall. I don't have Empress Woo in this picture. This is Zounds, I believe. And there's even a woodland iris that you can grow, Iris cristata, and it forms a big colony when it's happy. So it's such pretty little delicate flowers. And it doesn't take a lot of sun at all to get lots of blooms on this. So part shade, moist soil. Lamiastrum, anyone who's grown lamium knows it can be invasive, but I found this Lamiastrum Herman's Pride to be very well behaved and quite a pretty foliage for a shady area. It likes full to part shade, and it's quite drought tolerant once it's established. And Potaphyllum, so this is a relative of our native Mayapple, except it's very showy. As you can tell, spotty dotty, has lots of spots. And this is Potaphyllum versipel. So these are Japanese cousins to our native Mayapple. They do well in shade, and this one gets quite large, actually quite tall, and moist conditions. And Solomon Seal. Yeah, I know it's a love-hate relationship with Solomon Seal. So Some of you might be going, oh my God, I can't get rid of that stuff. And other people are saying, oh, I'd love to have some of that. If the common one is too aggressive for you, there is a variegated form that's not quite as aggressive. So you might want to look for that one. And again, the height on this one is really going to vary depending on how happy it is in your garden. I've seen it anywhere from, big patches that are only at 12 to 15 inches up to 24 inches. So really depends on where it's growing and how happy it is. Primulas. I love primulas, and they do well in moist shade. So if you've got that kind of conditions, they may go dormant in the summer if we have a drought year, or if you can keep them watered, they'll stay green, but not a problem. They'll go dormant, actually quite often come back in late August, September, and maybe even put some more blooms on for you. So Denticulata is the drumstick primula. Varus is the cowslip primula, and Pacific Giants, those are the ones you can pick up at the supermarket in March or so. And if you can get them to limp through, they don't usually like indoor conditions, but if you keep them alive, then you can put them out in your garden because they are perfectly hardy here. Palminarium, a great one for the shady area because it's got that bright foliage, an early spring flower, pollinators love, and they've been hybridizing, so you get different leaf patterns, and they will often go dormant, or after they bloom, they look a bit ratty, and I find if I just cut off all the old leaves and the flower stalks, that fresh new foliage comes in underneath, and it looks nice again for the rest of the season. Sinalesis, aconitifolium. What is the common name on this? I think it's threaded umbrella plant. So this is it when it first emerges. I just think it's so neat when it first comes out of the soil. And this is what it looks like the rest of the season. So it's quite highly dissected. Flower is not very significant. It's just a nice foliage plant for the shady area. Sturgis or toad lily. And there's different varieties, but quite often we think about the one that blooms in early September, the purple one. But there are earlier varieties, and it's a great one for the shade because, as we discussed earlier, there's not that many things that have an interesting bloom in the shade, but these guys are quite neat. And Trollius, globe flower. This is cheddar cheese. There's different forms of it. Violas, yeah, I probably shouldn't even show these because some of them are invasive. These are, I find these, the dancing geisha with the dissected leaves, not very invasive. This was not invasive at my previous property, and anyone who wants some is welcome to come and get them now from this property because they've just seeded themselves everywhere. And this is supposed to be a variegated form, Riviniana, sorry. And you can tell the variegation isn't too stable. It's only a couple leaves, so that's a bust. And then we have Mars with the reddish foliage. I did not find that one to be invasive. And our native Canadian one, which does spread, but if it's native, it's not invasive. So it can be aggressive, but not invasive. And they all like pulled apart shade, but they do make good ground covers if you do need a ground cover for the shade. And we can grow some annuals in the shade. If you've got a spot like under evergreen that you really are not able to grow something, then think about putting maybe some annuals in a container, put a planter down with some and put some annuals in it. So at least you can get some color in that area. Begonias do really well in shade. Of course, you will need to water them if they're in really dry shade or if they're in a planter, but they do quite well and put on a show all season. Coleus does well in shade. And again, the color intensity may vary depending on how much light or how much shade it's getting. Fuchsia do really well in hanging baskets or even in the ground in the shade. impatiens. These are the New Guinea impatiens. I know we're seeing the impatiens, the regular old impatiens, Walleriani, back in the stores, but I know some people who still have had problems with them, and I don't think they've got that fungal disease beat yet, so I'd be cautious on buying the regular impatiens. Annual geraniums, or proper names pelargoniums, actually can tolerate quite a bit of shade and put on a good show. So if you get one of those bright fluorescent orangey colors, they will pop in the shade. There's some pinks that are bright and fluorescent too that would do really well. And there's variegated foliage geraniums also. And the mass planting of annuals in the Toronto Botanical Garden. So you can kind of the seeing it all together, and pot scaping, as I said, is an option if you don't have a spot, if you don't have enough moisture or there's too dense tree roots, you always just put things in pots. Again, some New Guinea impatiens and some succulents and hostas, just a collection of planters. And bulbs will do well in shade, and probably not 100% accurate of me to say they do well in shade. They just come out so early that there is no shade at this point, because under a deciduous tree they haven't leafed out yet, so they can do well in those conditions, and they start to go dormant when the leaves come out. So they're doing just fine. So we have some cordalis, a daffodil, erythronium, and this is a relative of our trout lily. This is a cultivated form. And then, of course, we have the fritillaria. This is the guinea hen or checkered fritillaria, and galanthus, the snowdrops. And they all do well in the shade. So let's just look at some samples of shade gardens and how we can see it's putting it all together. So we've got the beautiful Japanese maple among a mass planting of hostas, and not fancy hostas, just good basic hostas. A little bit of garden art, some strands of glass, a mirror dangling from the tree. And this, of course, at Rita Woodland Ramble. Also at Rita Woodland Ramble, sometimes in the shade, you can add interest with some statuary. And again, just a mass planting of hostas and ligularia, but made, and will still be up here, but made interesting with the different layers and the stone background. This again is my previous garden. So you see a combination of sedges. We've got Beetlemania here, got Cotonia aster, and Stilby, hostas, Cutleaf stephanandra, heucheras, and some daylilies. Now, they will bloom in part shade. They won't be as prolific bloomers, but they will put some blooms on, so they are an option. This is that Cordalis operluca that I mentioned before. I said it self-seeds quite aggressively, but it's manageable and it's very dainty and pretty. So mixed with hostas and heucheras, and again, a daylily, some lamium in the background. Some hydrangeas in the shade, and structures, of course, always add interest. This was on, whenever I see GHS, I think of Gloucester Horticultural Society, and I know you use their GHS also. So that really threw me when I got an email from GHS, but this was the Gloucester Horticultural Society garden tour, and you can see the hostas and begonias and hydrangea and more hostas, so all working together in the shade. This is a pretty little garden in Maitland. Obviously gets enough sun to have these evergreens, but he's also got some great shrubs and things, euonymus and grasses, statuary, which just puts it all together quite nicely. Another garden on a Front of Young garden tour a couple of years ago. Beautiful hosta garden. And just these little impatiens plugged in here, and it just pops. It almost looks fluorescent in like almost a fluorescent light there. Another pretty little shade garden with a seating area. This was on a garden tour at the OHA convention when we had it in Kitchener-Waterloo. Now, I have to admit, most of these plants are invasive and I shouldn't even be showing you them, but it's just a good use of the space. They built a stream through it or redirected an existing stream. I'm not sure what they did. Creeping Jenny, bad plant, but look how it echoes the color in their furniture. This looks like English ivy. That's, you know, a terribly invasive plant. But they, you know, still are working the shade and have lots of good, interesting plants as well. Front of Young Garden tour, and this was not really a cultivated garden, but it was just beautiful the way they worked with nature. They carefully put in some plants, they carefully put in some steps and little things of interest, a landing with a seating area, but it was just so peaceful and cottagey feeling. It just had a magical feel to this garden. And this is in Richmond Hill on the OHA garden tour again. And again, we've got heuchera, stilbe, hostas, more heuchera, some evergreens mixed in, hydrangea, more hostas back here. So the ferns back here. Just jam-packed, full of plants, and just looking lovely for it. I think this is the same garden, just a different corner of it. And they really enjoyed whimsy in their garden. So they got the hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil frogs. And then they've got this big sculptured frog and lots of good plants to go with it. Hostas, stilbes. So I think there's a begonia in there. So little pops of color. Foliage working off each other, contrasting variegation with plain, just well done. Another garden on that same tour. They've mixed their annuals in with the perennials, put some pots in, angel wing begonia, more begonias down here. Just well done, Boston fern, and just so much interest in a little space. You don't think of small gardens having that much interest sometimes, but this one just packs such a punch because it's got so much going on. Another shade garden with the stream worked into it. And obviously there's enough sun for these water lilies to bloom, but there's also was quite a bit of shade in it. This is the Toronto Botanical Garden. And it may not be the fairest example because obviously they have deep pockets and can spend money on big Japanese maples. And they also have a team of volunteers that they call on. But it does show good contrast in foliage and texture and you know, good variety of heights. You know, obviously they've got professional designers who do this, but you can take lessons from this kind of picture and say, you know, I could recreate something similar to this in my little garden space. Although Toronto Botanical Garden, continuation of that same garden with that same stream running through it. More Japanese maple, hydrangea, some grasses and other Japanese maple. But this is more what we're dealing with, just our small backyards. And this was on our garden tour when we hosted the OHA convention in Kingston. And she used the Japanese forest grass, which is wonderful in shade, some heuchera, some hosta, a great combination. And these guys just, you know, they're little beacons in the garden. They just pop. The color just stands out very well. There's the same garden, but a repetition of the Japanese forest grass and a beautiful Japanese maple. And this is in my yard. This is one of my Japanese maple. And this is a elderberry lemon lace. And it's very nice and yellowy if it's got enough sun, and it's very cut leaf, so it's quite stunning. And they look good together. And since this was taken, I done some drastic pruning on this guy to open it up. So that's also important. If you're gardening in the shade and you want the layered effect, then sometimes you have to open up the canopy on these understory trees so that the plantings underneath really stand out. And this is a view of my garden, my back shade garden, but this is about, well, it's either 17 or 19, 2017 or 2019 when we had the high water, because that's my neighbor's dock, which has usually got about 3 feet of space under it. But anyways, so everything's matured more here in my garden. Things are looking fuller. But, you know, when I looked at this picture doing this presentation maybe a year and a half ago, I went, you know what? I keep preaching more about understory, but I need to develop that more. Now, I do have these azaleas here, and I've got more over here. So they are definitely growing and adding some of that height. But what I did last year is I went out and got some more Japanese maple, and I put one here, one here, and one way back here that, you know, but I only bought little tiny ones because they're a big investment and you want to get them started off in the ground when they've got a smaller root system and they can establish from day one. And plus then the investment's not so big. But I really am a true believer in starting small with plants or trees and shrubs, because they just, if you buy something that's, you know, in a 20-gallon pot and the roots are already going round and round in that pot, because from day one it's been growing in a tiny pot and then moved up to a bigger pot, bigger pot, bigger pot. Then when you try and get it in your garden, you'll never be able to untangle those roots and give it a fighting chance to get started. Whereas if you get the young plant in the 1-gallon pot and the roots are still softball, well, then you can straighten those out and spread them out properly like the spokes of a wagon wheel and get them growing and established, and they will catch up to that bigger plant fairly quickly because it's going to have more stress getting established. But anyways, having said all that, I added some Japanese maple, and it will be a while till I see the effect that I'm hoping for, but I'm thinking they will give me that understory effect. And I picked out ones that had golden foliage and auto foliage, so that should add another layer of interest also. So hopefully, you know, I've shared some ideas that you can put to use in your own garden. And as I've just shared from my own story, that we can always improve our gardens. And, you know, sometimes we just have to step back and take a look and say, what's missing, or what could I do here that might change the whole impact of the garden, and give it a try. You know, gardens are constantly evolving, so don't think it's you know, just because it was one way for a while that it's set that way forever. In fact, in the last 2 weeks, 3 weeks, this big ash came out, and my house is right here. So this ash needed to come out because it was already showing signs of ash borer. So it's made a huge difference in the back garden. And I'm interested to see how that's going to play out this summer with the extra light that's going to be coming in. So anyways, I've talked long enough. I have talked about all kinds of shade. I did not mention about growing under a black walnut. So if that is your issue, I recommend you visit the Morton Arboretum website. They have a list of a whole list of plants that will tolerate the juglone, the black walnut toxicity. So please do take a look at that if you have that issue in your garden. And that is it. I'm getting hoarse here from talking so much. So thank you very much. If you have any questions, I will try and answer them now.
One thing I find, Marianne, is some of the things that do perfectly well in full shade also do perfectly well in full sun, like Veroniastrum. It does just fine in full sun.
Yeah, some of them are very tolerant of all kinds of conditions. So, you know, that makes it a very versatile plant. So that's actually a good thing.
And I
Sometimes
don't,
it's just a matter of experimenting.
right. And I don't find it aggressive either, even in full sun. It seems to be, you know, relatively good for staying in its area. So,
Yeah.
Marianne, if any of us had the impression that there weren't many plants that did well in shade, you shattered that myth completely. That was fantastic. The native plants and the shrubs and the perennials, all of that was, all of your presentation was just, I was taking notes. I enjoyed it immensely. Thank you
Well,
so
and I
very
believe you recorded it too, so if anyone needs a refresher, they can watch it again.
Wonderful. Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marianne. I think we've all come away with some different ideas to
Mhm.
go home and try in different spots in our gardens. And as you say, sometimes you just want to experiment a little bit and try something different. There's no harm in experimenting. If you like it, you can add more. If it didn't work out, try something else. But that was
Exactly.
very good list of plants. I was frantically making notes here.
Yeah,